The wagon disappeared over the first rise at 7:30 in the morning, and Clara Holt did not wave. She stood beside the barn in her husband's old coat, the one she had taken to wearing 3 winters ago when Edmund died and she needed something large enough to put her whole self into. And she watched the wagon grow small against the brass-colored grass of the Wyoming high plains, until it was a dark speck and then nothing at all. The sky was enormous and pale and indifferent. The wind came from the northwest the way it always did, constant and without mercy, bending the grass in long, slow waves that traveled east, like the memory of something that had already passed. Clara was 63 years old. She had lived on this quarter section of Wyoming soil for 15 years. She had survived 2 summers when the rain did not come, and 1 spring when the creek flooded, and took the fence lines, and 3 winters that the old-timers said were bad, but that Clara knew from her own records, from her own numbers written in her own hand every morning and every evening without exception, were only the beginning of what this country could do. She had buried her husband in the earth of this place 3 years ago, and had stayed. She had watched her son Callum grow from a young man with ambitions into a man of 42 who worked in Chicago and believed that facts were things other people invented. The wagon was gone. Callum had left her $12 in coins and small bills tucked into an envelope under the loose floorboard in the northwest corner of the barn. He had left it with a note written in his careful hand. She had read the note once standing in the barn in the gray pre-dawn light, while Callum was still loading the last of his things onto the wagon. She had read it once and then folded it precisely along its original creases and placed it back in the envelope and set the envelope back under the floorboard. The note said, "When you are ready to admit I was right, use this for the train ticket to Chicago. You will be dead before Christmas if you stay. There is nothing left to prove here. Come before the cold takes you." Clara stood at the fence line and looked at the empty road for another long moment after the wagon had disappeared. Then she turned and walked back toward the barn. Her knees gave their usual opinion about the cold morning. She had learned not to argue with her knees. She had learned simply to keep moving, which was the same thing she had learned about most difficulties in 15 years on this land. She went into the barn. It was 20 feet square, tight-jointed, solid. Edmund had built it the first month they arrived back when he was still a man who believed that if you built the right thing in the right way, it would outlast everything that tried to destroy it. He had been right about the barn. He had overbuilt it the way engineers overbuild things they respect, doubling the crossbeam reinforcement, choosing seasoned lumber over green, fitting the roof with a steep pitch that shed snow before it could accumulate to dangerous weight. The barn was the best structure on the property. It had always been the best structure on the property. Clara had known this for years. She had written it in her records. She had done the calculations. She walked to the center of the barn floor and stood still for a moment. The floor was packed earth, uneven in places, the marks of years of use pressed into its surface. In the northwest corner where Callum had hidden the money, the floorboards were loose over a small space that had once held tools and now held $12 and a note telling her to give up. She did not go to the northwest corner. She went to the trunk. Edmund's trunk sat against the east wall, iron-bound, scarred from the years of travel that had preceded his settling heavy with the accumulated weight of a life spent in motion. He had been a railroad engineer before he became a Wyoming farmer, an assistant on the transcontinental line in the 1870s, a man who had read elevation maps the way other men read scripture and understood the physics of moving weight across distance with the particular intimacy of someone who had staked his life on getting those calculations right. He had kept his books. Clara opened the trunk. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 17 volumes, engineering manuals, thermodynamics, structural mechanics, the mathematics of heat transfer, material science texts with diagrams of bridges and boilers and retaining walls, books with tables of thermal conductivity and specific heat capacity and R values for different types of insulation. She had read every one of them. She had read them first when Edmund was alive, sitting beside him at the kitchen table in the evenings, when he was studying by lamplight, watching the diagrams over his shoulder. And asking questions he was too tired to answer properly, so she had answered them herself. She had gone back to the books alone in the mornings before Edmund woke and read what she needed to read, and worked out what she needed to work out and written what she understood in her own hand in her own notebook. That had been 15 years ago. She lifted the books out one by one and set them carefully on the barn floor. 17 volumes. She knew the weight of each one, the particular texture of each spine against her palm. She set them aside. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in a separate piece of cloth, was Edmund's personal journal. His professional journal, not the engineering texts, but his own handwritten record of calculations, observations, questions he had never answered. She had not opened it since his death. She had not needed to. She set his journal aside, and there in the very bottom of the trunk was what she had actually come for. Her own journal. Not one journal. 9 of them bound with a piece of twine. 9 identical leather notebooks that she had filled over 15 years with the most careful, systematic, relentless record of observation she knew how to make. Every morning at 6. Every evening at 6. 2 readings per day without exception. Temperature inside the cabin. Temperature outside. Wind direction and estimated speed. Precipitation. The behavior of the animals, particularly the burrowing animals, the badgers and prairie dogs, and foxes who lived in the ground and survived Wyoming winters that killed cattle and broke iron. Clara lifted the 9 journals out with both hands. She carried them to the center of the barn floor and sat down cross-legged, her knees objecting and then accepting, and she opened the oldest journal to the first page. September 15th, 1872. Arrived. Temperature at arrival 68 degrees Fahrenheit, wind from northwest. Edmund says this land will break you if you let it. I intend not to let it. 15 years ago to the day. She sat on the barn floor and she turned pages for 2 hours. She was not reading for the first time. She had read these pages many times, had studied them, had drawn conclusions from them, had revised those conclusions as more data accumulated. What she was doing now was something different. She was conducting a final review before a decision that could not be undone. She was checking her own work the way Edmund had always checked his engineering calculations before committing to a design. Not because she doubted the numbers, but because the numbers deserved to be trusted. And trust was something you earned through verification. The data was consistent. The data had always been consistent. That was the nature of data collected carefully over a long period of time. It did not lie. It did not change its mind based on how cold you were or how tired you were, or whether your son had just driven away in a wagon and left you $12 and a note that said you would be dead before Christmas. February 14th, 1874. Outside temperature, -8 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside cabin temperature, 43 degrees Fahrenheit, with stove burning continuously consuming approximately 12 pounds of wood per hour. Wind from northwest sustained at 30 miles per hour. Then the entry she had made 4 days later. Examined badger burrow in east pasture. Entrance faces southeast, shielded from prevailing wind. Depth approximately 4 feet. Temperature at terminus 46 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside temperature 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Differential 24 degrees. No heat source. Insulation is the earth itself. She had written that in 1874. She had been 49 years old, and she had understood something that morning crouched at the entrance to a badger burrow, with a thermometer that most people on this high plane would never understand, because they never thought to ask the question the data was answering. March 3rd, 1876. Conclusion. Preliminary cabin design is fundamentally flawed. Volume too large for available fuel. Surface area to volume ratio unfavorable. 6 windows create thermal bridges. Log construction, though structurally sound, provides minimal insulation. Estimated R value approximately 8. Insufficient. August 12th, 1887. 1 month ago. Final conclusion, alternative approach required. She had drawn a diagram on that page. A cross-section of the barn. The existing timber walls shown as thin black lines. Then 3 feet out from those walls, another line thick and shaded labeled earth mass, compacted sod minimum 36 inches. Between the 2 walls, a gap of 2 feet labeled air cavity convection barrier. She had calculated the thermal performance. The earth would provide mass. The air would provide resistance. Together, they would create an R value of approximately 40. The cabin had an R value of 8. The difference was not incremental. It was categorical. The barn was 20 by 20 feet, 400 square feet. Low ceiling approximately 9 feet at the peak. 3,000 cubic feet of air to heat. The cabin was 30 by 40 feet high ceilings, 6 windows, 10,000 cubic feet. The math was simple. The cabin was a losing game. The barn was possible. Clara closed the journals. She sat for a moment with her hands resting on the leather covers, all 9 of them stacked beside her on the earth floor of the barn. 15 years of mornings and evenings. 15 years of numbers that she had written down, because she believed that if you paid attention carefully enough and long enough, the world would tell you what it was. She stood up. Her knees made their usual complaints. She picked up the journals and carried them to the shelf she had built against the east wall. The shelf where she kept her lamp and her matches and the small iron pot she used for morning coffee. She set the journals there beside Edmund's 17 engineering texts. Then she walked to the equipment shed. The sod cutter was a heavy iron implement designed to be pulled by a team of oxen. Clara stood looking at it for several minutes, turning the problem of it over in her mind, the way she turned all problems, examining it from different angles, looking for the principle that would make the impossible merely difficult. She had no oxen. Edmund had sold them in the spring before he died, when he was already sick and knew it, and was making what he called practical decisions and what Clara called preparation for leaving. She walked to the woodpile and selected the longest, straightest piece of ash she could find. 6 feet long, thick as her wrist. She carried it back to the equipment shed and studied the harness points on the sod cutter for a long time. An hour later, she had a system. She drove an iron stake into the ground 50 feet north of the barn. She attached a rope to the stake and threaded it back through a pulley she had salvaged from the old well mechanism that Edmund had rebuilt in 1879 and that had stopped functioning properly in 1883. The ash branch became a lever wedged against the cutter's frame at a precise angle she had calculated to maximize mechanical advantage given her weight and the resistance of Wyoming sod. She positioned the blade at the starting point. She pulled. The cutter resisted. The earth held. Clara leaned her full weight into the lever, her boots finding purchase in the hard ground. Her back straight, her arms extended, and she felt the blade bite. 6 inches of progress. She walked to the stake wound, the rope around the pulley, locked it, walked back to the cutter. pulled again. 6 more inches. This would be her life for the next 10 weeks. She worked until the light failed. By sunset, she had cut a strip 12 feet long. She used Edmund's old spade to section it into bricks 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, 4 inches thick. She lifted the first brick. 50 pounds of earth and grass, and roots dense and heavy and smelling of soil. And something older than soil. Something that had been pressed into the ground over thousands of years by the weight of wind and rain, and the slow insistence of grass growing and dying and growing again. She carried it to the barn and set it on the ground exactly 3 feet from the north wall. Then she went back and got another. By dark, she had moved 18 bricks. Her hands were raw at the base of every finger. Her shoulders burned with a deep heat that was not the same as the heat of the stove, but was related to it. The heat of muscles asked to do more than they had recently been asked to do. She had covered perhaps 6 linear feet of the wall she needed to build. She needed 2,000 more bricks. Clara heated water over the small cast iron stove and cleaned her hands, pressing the cloth carefully into each abraded place, taking inventory of the damage without sentiment. She ate cornbread and dried meat sitting at the small table she had moved into the barn's interior corner the previous week. When she had begun to understand that she would not be sleeping in the cabin this winter, she lit the lamp and opened the most recent of her journals. September 15th, 1887. Callum departed at 7:30. Construction begins. Leverage system functional but inefficient. Output 18 bricks in 6 hours. Required daily output to complete north and west walls before freeze 22 bricks. Adjustment required. She closed the journal. Outside, the wind pressed against the barn walls with the steady, patient pressure of something that had been doing this for a very long time and was prepared to continue. The timbers flexed slightly and settled. Cold air seeped through the gaps in the chinking, the same gaps she had been meaning to address since spring. The same gaps that were part of the reason she was sitting in a barn instead of a cabin, planning to wrap the entire structure in 3 feet of compressed earth. She could spend $12 on a train ticket, or she could spend 10 weeks building a wall. Clara banked the fire and lay down on the bedroll she had arranged in the corner she was beginning to think of as her room, though it had no walls yet, and only the borrowed privacy of darkness. She pulled the blankets up. The cold settled around her. She did not sleep immediately. She lay on her back in the dark and thought about the calculations, running them again in her head. Not because she doubted them, but because the repetition of them was a comfort. The way certain people repeated prayers. R value of 40. 3,000 cubic feet. Thermal mass. Air gap. Convection barrier. The numbers held. They had always held. She slept. She was up before the gray arrived. She adjusted the leverage system, repositioning the stake, shortening the lever arm, changing the angle of the rope. By noon, she was cutting faster. By evening, she had produced 24 bricks. The day after that, 27. Her body adapted the way bodies adapt to sustained physical demand, not by becoming immune to the pain, but by incorporating it, making it part of the rhythm of the work, rather than an interruption of it. Her hands toughened. The raw places became calluses. The burning in her shoulders became simply the sensation that meant she was working. She learned which patches of ground cut easiest, where the grass grew thickest and the roots formed the densest mat. She learned to read the soil by color, to avoid the sandy patches that crumbled when she tried to lift them to seek the dark loam that held together like fabric. She began to think of the bricks as units of something more than weight. 50 pounds of thermal mass, 50 pounds of stored heat waiting to be activated. 50 pounds of the argument she was making against winter. By the end of the first week, she had 300 bricks stacked beside the north wall of the barn. She began laying the foundation course. She dug a trench 8 inches deep, running parallel to the north wall 3 feet out from it. She lined the bottom of the trench with gravel she hauled from the creek bed in buckets 2 trips per morning before she began cutting the gravel for drainage, because a wall that absorbed moisture would lose its insulating properties. And she was not building a wall that would fail. Then she began laying bricks, grass side down, joints staggered each course offset from the one below it, by half a brick length, the way a mason staggers stone. Every third course she laid bricks perpendicular to the wall, face tying the outer surface to the inner, creating a structure that would hold its own weight without depending on the barn wall for support. The physics of it were woven into every motion. Each brick was thermal mass. The wall would store whatever heat the weak winter sun could provide during the day and release it slowly at night, smoothing out the temperature swings that made Wyoming winters not just cold, but brutal. And the air gap, the 2 feet of still air between the earth wall and the barn's timber frame, was the critical element. Still air was among the best insulators that existed. Moving air stripped heat from surfaces. A 30-mile-an-hour wind could pull warmth through a log wall 20 times faster than still air. The air gap made the wind irrelevant. Clara had calculated this. She had been calculating it in various forms since 1874, since the morning she had crouched at a badger burrow in the east pasture with a thermometer, and understood something that had not been written in any book she had access to, but that was nonetheless true. Demonstrably, measurably, irrefutably true. The earth was warmer than the wind. It had always been warmer than the wind. She was simply going to put that fact to use. On the morning of September 29th, 2 weeks into construction, she had her first visitor. Earl Stratton rode up just after sunrise. He was 67 years old, a man who had been on this frontier for 4 decades, and who showed every one of them in the architecture of his face, the deep lines in the weathered color, and the particular stillness of someone who had survived enough bad seasons to stop being surprised by difficulty. He owned the largest ranch in the valley, 3,000 acres, and 200 head of cattle, a stone fireplace and glass windows, and 2 ranch hands who earned their wages doing the work that keeps a large operation functioning through the kind of winters that made lesser operations disappear. He had built half the cabins in the territory. He knew construction the way Clara knew thermodynamics from the inside out from years of practice and a few hard lessons. He dismounted and walked slowly around the barn, studying what Clara had built. The foundation trench was complete. The north wall stood 4 feet high, a dense, organic-looking mass of compressed earth. Clara kept working. She lifted another brick, carried it, set it carefully in place, tamped it down with the heel of her hand. Earl watched. His voice, when he finally spoke, was neither kind nor unkind. It was the voice of a man stating observed fact. "Miss Holt, what in God's name are you doing?" Clara straightened. She met his eyes. Her hands were caked with clay and grass stains. Her dress was torn at the hem where she had caught it on the iron stake 3 days ago and had not taken the time to mend it. She looked exactly like what she was, a 63-year-old woman alone on a quarter section of Wyoming high plains in late September, doing something that no one in this valley had ever seen done before. "Improving the barn," she said. Her voice was flat and factual. Earl walked closer and examined the brickwork. He kicked at the base with his boot. Solid. Dense. He ran his hand along the surface. Then he said the thing she had expected him to say. Wet earth against timber. That wall will sweat all winter. Moisture gets into your main posts, and by spring you will have rot. By next winter, the whole structure could come down on your head. Clara pointed to the gap between the earth wall and the barn's timber frame. Airspace, she said. 2 feet. Moisture will not cross it. Earl made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was the sound of a man encountering something he considered both wrong and beneath serious argument. He shook his head. The gesture was not mocking. It was something worse than mocking. It was the slow, settled certainty of 40 years of experience dismissing 45 minutes of someone else's inexperience. He told her the sod was for houses with people and fires to keep things dry, not for wrapping around a barn. He told her the weight alone was a structural risk. He told her that she needed to understand what Wyoming January looked like from inside a properly built structure. Then his voice softened slightly, and that was the worst part. The softening, because it meant he had moved from assessment to pity. My wife could use help. Helen is getting on in years. You would have a warm place and 3 meals. Honest work. Clara did not look at him. She bent and lifted another brick. I am fine here, Mr. Stratton. Earl sighed with the particular quality of a man who has done what he could. He climbed back on his horse. Suit yourself. But do not come to me when those walls start to weep. He rode away. Clara watched him go. Then she set the brick in place and reached for another. The nickname started the following week. She rode to the trading post on the 3rd of October for salt and kerosene. The post was a rough plank building at the crossroads 10 miles east. The place where news moved through the valley like water through flat ground, gathering and spreading and leaving deposits. As she tied her horse, she heard a voice from the porch. Frank Dolan, freight driver, large man, larger mouth. The kind of cruelty that required an audience and therefore always found one. Look who crawled out of the dirt. She heard him address the men leaning against the porch rail. The Holt woman. Building herself a tomb out there. Getting a head start on things. Laughter. The kind that was not entirely mean, but was not interested in being kind. Clara kept her head down. She went inside and bought her supplies, and did not look at anyone except the clerk Hastings, who was polite and distant, and gave her exactly what she came for without elaboration. She left. Frank was still on the porch. Need help hauling all that dirt, tomb builder? I got a wagon. Could bury you proper. She untied her horse and rode away. Her face burned. Her throat was tight. She did not look back. The name stuck. The tomb builder. It spread through the valley the way all names do in small communities, quickly and without mercy. Carried on the ordinary conversation of people who needed something to talk about in a long autumn before a hard winter. Riders would slow on the county road and look at the strange earthen mound rising against the barn's north wall and say something to the person beside them and ride on. Clara kept working. On the 12th of October, a man from the county land office arrived in a small buggy. His name was Aldrich, and he wore a wool suit and carried a leather satchel, and had the manner of someone performing a duty he found personally distressing. He measured the wall thickness with a folding ruler. He examined the roof, checking for stress signs. He made notes in a small ledger with the systematic unhurriedness of a man who had been doing this for a long time. Miss Holt, he said, I have to be honest. I have assessed frontier structures for a decade. This is not in any manual I have seen. The weight of this earth on unbraced walls is a significant structural risk. The county cannot be held liable for any incidents. Clara was mixing clay and water to chink gaps in the lower courses, her hands gray with the mix. working the material with the particular rhythm she had developed over the previous weeks, the rhythm that was becoming automatic, the way the sod-cutting rhythm had become automatic, the rhythm of someone who has done something enough times that the body takes over. The walls are braced by the barn itself, she said quietly. The weight is compressive. It holds itself up. Aldrich peered at her over his spectacles. Are you an engineer, Miss Holt? She looked at him. Mud on her hands, dirt under her nails. 63 years old, gray hair, bad knees. Standing in a Wyoming barn in the middle of October. I am someone who pays attention, she said, and does the math. Aldrich made another note in his ledger. His face was not unkind, but it had already decided. He told her he would have to file a report noting the unconventional and potentially hazardous nature of the structure for the record. He climbed back into his buggy. He did not know as he drove away with his notes and his professional assessment that he would be back, that his second visit would produce a very different document, that the document he would eventually write about this structure would travel farther than he had ever traveled in his life. But that was later. That was February. Clara went back to work. The days shortened. The temperature began its long, reliable drop a degree or two per day, the cold coming in like a tide that knew exactly where it was going. October gave way to November. The first light snow fell on the 8th, a dusting that melted by noon, a courtesy warning before the real thing arrived. Clara worked faster. Her output climbed. 30 bricks per day, 35. She was running the system with the focused efficiency of someone who understood the calendar and had no margin for sentiment. The north wall reached full height, 10 feet, 3 feet thick, a fortress of earth. She started on the west wall. The wind came from the west and north. Those were the directions that mattered. The south and east could remain open. She had already partitioned off a corner inside the barn, 10 feet by 10 feet, just large enough for a bed and a stove, and a table small enough that the heat she could generate with limited fuel could maintain a livable temperature. She had done the calculations. By the 18th of November, both walls were nearly complete. The structure looked strange organic, as though the barn were being slowly absorbed back into the landscape, returning to the earth it had been lifted from. The lines were rough, not the clean geometry of timber and plank. It looked ancient. It looked primitive. It looked like a burial mound. Clara stood back one evening and let herself see it the way the valley saw it. She heard Frank Dolan's voice in her mind. She heard Earl Stratton's slow dismissal. She heard the laughter from the porch of the trading post, the sound of people who had made up their minds before looking at the numbers. She opened her journal. She reviewed her calculations. The numbers did not care what the structure looked like. The numbers did not care about Frank Dolan or Earl Stratton, or the note still sitting under the floorboard in the northwest corner of this same barn. The note that said she would be dead before Christmas. The numbers said this would work. She had been living with these numbers for 15 years. She had watched them prove themselves correct in small ways in badger burrows and storm cellars, and the behavior of animals that had evolved over thousands of years. To know things about cold and earth that the people building log cabins on this high plain had never thought to ask about. The numbers had never lied to her. She had never given them reason to. On the night of November 21st, she woke to a sound outside the barn. Footsteps, quiet, deliberate. Clara lay still and listened. Her heart was steady. She had long since made peace with most of the fears that the night carries for a woman alone on an isolated property. Not because she was unafraid, but because she had found that fear without action was simply waste and she had no fuel to waste. She crept to a knothole in the timber wall and looked out. Two men. One was Frank Dolan, unmistakable even in shadow, big and deliberate in his movements, a man who took up a lot of space and knew it. The other was younger, thinner, someone from town she did not recognize. They were at her woodpile. They were loading wood onto a small cart, not taking everything just enough to hurt, just enough to matter. She heard Frank's voice carry on the still air. She will not need it anyway. Probably frozen solid in her little tomb by February. We are practically doing her a favor. One less thing to haul out come spring. They worked for 5 minutes. Then they left, pulling the cart away into the darkness without looking back. Clara stood motionless for a long time after the sound of the cart faded. Her hands were not shaking. She had noticed that about herself over the past 15 years, that the moments when other people shook were often the moments when she became most still. Edmund had noticed it too. He had called it her engineering mode, the state she entered when the problem was serious enough to require all of her attention and none of her agitation. She could ride to the sheriff in town. She could report the theft. She could stand in the sheriff's office with her gray hair and her muddy dress and tell a story about Frank Dolan in the dark. And she already knew with the same certainty she brought to her thermal calculations how that story would end. She did not ride to the sheriff. In the morning, she walked to the woodpile and counted what remained. She did the calculation. At her projected fuel consumption based on the thermal model she had been refining for 3 years and testing for the past 2 weeks, she had enough wood to reach late February. Before the theft, she had a margin of approximately 3 weeks beyond that. Now she had no margin. She stood at the woodpile in the cold November morning with the numbers arranged in her mind, clean and precise and honest. 0 margin. No room for error. No room for a calculation that turned out to be slightly wrong. No room for a storm longer than she had modeled. No room for a seal that failed, or a gap that let in more cold than she had anticipated. Clara walked back to the barn. She sat at her small table. She opened the journal to a fresh page. November 21st, 1887. Fuel supply reduced by theft. Estimated loss 1/4 cord. New margin 0. The math still holds. The wall must perform as calculated. No variation permitted. She looked at the words for a moment. Then she wrote one more line. Proceed. She closed the journal and went back to work. By the 24th of November, both walls were complete. The north face and the west face of the barn were encased in earth, 3 feet of compressed sod that had hardened in the cold to something approaching stone. The surface was rough, already acquiring the dark, permanent look of something that had always been there. The total cost in cash was 0. The cost in labor was every morning and every evening and every hour between them for 10 weeks. Clara walked inside. She had already arranged her corner. The small cast-iron stove Edmund had kept in the barn for winter work sat in the center of the 10 by 10 space she had claimed. A stovepipe ran up through the roof. Beside the stove, a wooden crate that served as a table. A bedroll on the floor. Her lamp. Her journals. Edmund's 17 engineering texts on the shelf against the east wall. She built a small fire. 4 logs. The stove heated quickly, the way a small space heats, when the walls are doing what walls should do and the volume of air is manageable. She put a pot of water on to boil. Then she walked outside and looked at the thermometer she had mounted on the barn's exterior wall. 22 degrees Fahrenheit. She went back inside. She waited 1 hour. She sat at her table with her journal open and her pen in her hand, and she did not write anything. She simply waited, which was its own kind of work. Then she checked the interior thermometer, 54 degrees Fahrenheit, a differential of 32 degrees, with 4 logs, in a barn on the Wyoming high plains in late November. Clara looked at the number for a long time. Then she looked at the wall. The timber wall of the original barn, dry and solid, and showing no sign of moisture exactly as she had calculated. Then she looked at the air gap, 2 feet of still air that the wind could not reach and could not use. Then she wrote in her journal, November 24th, 1887, construction complete. First thermal test, exterior 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Interior 54 degrees Fahrenheit. 4 logs. Air gap performing as calculated. No moisture detected on timber walls. Structure stable. Initial results confirm projections. She closed the journal. Outside, the first real snow of the season began to fall. Not a dusting this time. Real snow, steady and purposeful. The kind that covered fences and made the familiar landscape unfamiliar. Clara banked the fire and lay down on her bedroll and pulled the blankets up and listened to the snow against the outer earth wall. The soft, insistent sound of winter arriving to make its argument. The wall answered with silence. The air gap answered with stillness. The numbers answered the way numbers always answer, without drama, without doubt, without any interest in whether you believed them or not. 3 miles away, Earl Stratton stood in his ranch house, feeding split oak into a fireplace that roared like something trying to prove a point. The house was 46 degrees. Helen sat wrapped in blankets, shivering. The thermometer outside read 19 degrees. Earl looked out the window toward the dark shape of the high plains, the Holt place, invisible in the distance, the snow falling between them. She will not last the month, he said to the fire. The fire crackled. The wind howled. The temperature kept dropping. And in a barn 3 miles away, in a space 10 feet by 10 feet wrapped in earth and still air, a 63-year-old woman with a journal full of 15 years of numbers lay in 54 degrees and slept. December came in cold and stayed cold. The first week brought temperatures that made the old-timers at the trading post shake their heads and speak in the low, measured tones they reserved for weather that was no longer ordinary. Single digits at night, teens during the day. The kind of cold that made breath freeze in beards before a man could speak, that turned the water in the stock troughs to solid ice by midnight and kept it that way until noon. The kind of cold that had a personality to it, deliberate and unhurried, the cold of a thing that knew it had time. Clara kept her records. Every morning at 6. Every evening at 6. 2 measurements per day without exception, the same discipline she had maintained for 15 years. Because the value of data was in its consistency, and consistency was a choice you made before you needed it, not after. December 1st. Outside temperature 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood burned 6 pounds, 4 logs of split cottonwood. Wind from northwest sustained 20 miles per hour. December 2nd. Outside 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood burned 6 pounds. Wind from northwest sustained 25 miles per hour. December 3rd. Outside 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood burned 7 pounds. Wind from north gusting to 30. The pattern was clear, and it was exactly what she had predicted. As the outside temperature dropped, she added slightly more fuel, but the relationship was not linear, and it was not desperate. She was burning 7 to 8 pounds of wood per day to maintain temperatures in the low 50s. She did the math as she always did, as a kind of morning prayer. The arithmetic of survival laid out in her head before she rose from the bedroll. 7 pounds per day. 50 pounds per week, 200 pounds per month. She had approximately 1,500 pounds of wood remaining inside the barn, protected from theft and weather by the barn walls themselves. 3 months of fuel at this rate, perhaps 4 if she was careful. The winter would demand 5 months. But she was not worried. Not yet. Because the wall was doing something she had predicted, but had not quite believed until she could see it in the numbers on the page. It was storing heat. On sunny days, even the weak, low-angle winter sun of Wyoming. December, the exterior surface of the sod wall would warm slightly. Dark earth absorbed radiation. That stored warmth migrated inward through the 3 feet of compressed mass, slowly taking hours to penetrate the full depth. By evening, by night, the interior surface of the sod was radiating that captured warmth back into the air gap and through the air gap into the barn itself. The system was not just insulating, it was buffering, smoothing the brutal swings between day cold and night cold into something the small stove could manage without working at its limits. On December 8th, she noticed something she had not fully anticipated. The interior temperature was rising without any increase in fuel consumption. She was burning the same amount she had burned the previous week, but the temperature inside her small space had climbed to 56 degrees, and then to 57. She checked her notes. She examined the structure. Then she understood. The earth wall was seasoning. As moisture left the compressed sod, the thermal performance improved. Dry earth insulated better than wet earth by a measurable factor she had found in one of Edmund's material science texts 3 years ago. A number she had incorporated into her calculations but had wondered privately whether field conditions would match laboratory values. They matched. They matched closely enough that she sat at her small table for several minutes without doing anything except looking at the interior thermometer and allowing herself to feel the particular quality of satisfaction that comes when the world confirms what the numbers said it would do. She was alone in a barn in the middle of Wyoming in the coldest December in 20 years. And the evidence was accumulating. 3 miles west, Earl Stratton was burning wood like a locomotive. He had 2 ranch hands that winter, young men who earned their wages and their bunks and their 3 meals per day. One of them spent 6 hours every day doing nothing but splitting and hauling firewood. The ranch house had a massive stone fireplace capable of holding logs 4 feet long, and Earl kept it burning from dawn to dusk and through the night on a rotating watch. The heat was substantial, and the house was big, high ceilings and 3 rooms and windows on all 4 sides. Each window a place where warmth leaked out and cold pushed in. The interior temperature hovered at 46 degrees. Helen Stratton wore 2 wool sweaters and a heavy shawl at all times, even at the dinner table. She slept under 4 blankets. In the mornings, she could see her own breath until the fireplace had been burning for an hour. Earl burned through half a cord of wood every 3 days. He had laid in 20 cords for the winter, enough by every calculation he had ever used, every formula, built from 40 years of surviving on this high plain. At this rate of consumption, he would run out before March. And it was only December. Ruth brought it up at dinner on December 12th. The venison stew was hot, and the coffee was hot. And those were the 2 warm things in a room that was otherwise conducting a slow negotiation with the temperature outside. She set down her cup and looked at him the way she looked at him when she had already decided something and was only waiting for him to arrive at the same conclusion. Marcus, she said. She called him by his given name when the conversation was serious. We cannot keep burning at this rate. Earl chewed, looked at the fire. He had done the calculation himself every morning for a week. He knew the answer before she finished the sentence. What would you have me do? He said. Let us freeze. She did not answer that. She did not need to. She had been married to him for 31 years, and she knew that some questions were not questions. 4 miles east of the Stratton Ranch, Silas Greer was in worse shape than Earl, and without the resources to do anything about it. Silas was 48 years old, a homesteader with a one-room cabin he had built himself with the skills of a farmer, applied to the work of a carpenter, which is to say the structure stood but barely, and the margins between standing and not standing were narrower than they looked. The chinking between the logs was uneven, applied in the optimistic warmth of September, with the intention to go back and fix the thin spots before winter, an intention that had been overtaken by the 100 other urgent tasks of a small farm, trying to make it through one more season. Cold air came in through gaps so small you could not see them, but could feel them on the back of your hand as you walked past. The door fit poorly in its frame, a problem Silas had been planning to fix since the previous spring. They were burning a cord and a half per week, mostly green wood hauled from the creek bottom, where the cottonwoods grew wood that had been cut in October instead of the previous spring, and that produced more smoke than heat, because the moisture in it was still fighting the fire. The stovepipe was caking with creosote, narrowing from the inside, restricting the draw and reducing efficiency. The interior temperature of the cabin stayed around 40 degrees on good days and dropped below that on bad ones. Miriam Greer made the best of it, the way women in that country made the best of things that were not good, with competence and without self-pity, and with a constant, low-level attention to her 3 children. That was its own form of engineering. The engineering of keeping small bodies warm with inadequate resources. The oldest child was 12. The middle child was 8. The youngest was Grace, 3 years old, small for her age, with her mother's dark eyes and the particular vulnerability of the very young to cold that enters slowly and stays. On December 9th, Grace developed a cough, wet, deep, the kind that started in the chest and worked outward. Miriam watched it for 2 days with the attention of a woman who had seen this kind of cough before and knew what it could become. On the evening of December 12th, she bundled herself against the cold and walked through the dark to the Holt property 3 miles across frozen ground, because there was no one else to go to. And Clara Holt was the only person in the valley who had showed any sign of knowing what she was doing this winter. Clara opened the barn door to find Miriam Greer standing in the cold, with her coat wrapped tight and her face carrying the particular expression of a woman who has been managing fear for 3 days and is now past the point of managing it alone. Clara brought her inside. Grace had a fever, a wet cough. 3 days in. The nearest doctor was in town 10 miles and the road had drifted badly in the last storm. Miriam described the child's breathing, the sound of it, the labor of it. Clara listened without interrupting, the way she listened to data, completely cataloging. She gave Miriam what she had: a bottle of camphor oil for the chest, instructions for a steam treatment using the kettle. She wrote down the intervals and the method on a page, torn from her journal, her small, precise handwriting clear enough to follow by lamplight. Then she asked about the stove, about the wood, about the gaps in the chinking and the door that did not fit. Miriam's face changed in the way faces change when someone names the thing that is actually wrong, instead of the thing that is merely the most visible symptom. Silas has been meaning to fix the door since April, she said. Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she said, I can show him a method for the north wall that would make a difference. Not a full enclosure. 2 feet of earth, just the north face. It could be done in a week even now. Miriam was quiet. Then she said, he will think I am telling him his business is not good enough. Clara said nothing to that. She walked Miriam back out into the cold with the camphor oil and the written instructions, and the knowledge of what she had not said and would not say which was that the cabin's situation was not sustainable at current temperatures and that what was coming in January would be a different category of problem than what December had already been. She walked back into the barn. She sat at her table in 56 degrees, and she opened her journal, and she wrote December 12th. Miriam Greer visited. Grace Greer, age 3. Cough and fever, day 3. Cabin conditions inadequate. Proposed north wall modification. Proposal declined by circumstance. The numbers do not lie. But the numbers require someone to act on them before the problem arrives, not after it has already come through the door. She underlined the last sentence. Then she closed the journal and sat in the warmth of the small space and thought about what she had not been able to say, which was this, that she had been watching. This happened for 15 years. The gap between what the numbers showed and what people were willing to do about the numbers, and she had never found a way to close that gap with words alone. She had only ever been able to close it by building something. December continued its patient descent. The temperature dropped by small, reliable increments each day, the cold accumulating the way debt accumulates in amounts too small to feel in any single moment, but impossible to ignore when you looked at the full account. Clara's records showed the pattern with the clarity of long observation. The wall was performing. The system was stabilizing. By mid-December, she was maintaining 58 degrees, with the same fuel consumption she had required to achieve 52 degrees in November. The continuing improvement as the sod dried and the air gap aged. She read Edmund's engineering texts in the evenings, not because she needed to, but because she wanted the company of careful thinking, the particular comfort of someone else's systematic mind applied to problems that had principles and solutions. She reread the sections on thermal mass. She found one calculation she had underestimated slightly and corrected her model. The correction was in her favor. The system was performing better than she had calculated. She allowed herself privately and without ceremony to note this. On December 15th, she rode into town for the first time since October. She needed salt, perhaps coffee if the price was reasonable. The trading post was crowded. Men clustered around the central stove in the configuration that formed naturally in cold weather, a loose circle with no assigned places, but understood hierarchies of warmth and standing. The conversation stopped in the incremental way it stops when someone enters a room and the room is deciding how to receive them. Clara gathered her items from the shelves and brought them to the counter. Hastings tallied them with professional neutrality and began wrapping them in brown paper. Frank Dolan walked in from the back. He saw her immediately. The performance that followed was not spontaneous. It had the quality of something that had been constructed in advance and was now being delivered for an audience it had been waiting for. He walked to the counter with the deliberate slowness of a man who understands that timing is part of the effect. He leaned against the wood beside her. He informed the room that the tomb builder lived that she must be getting mighty cold out there, all alone in her little dirt castle, that he had a bet going that Marcus Brennan himself had placed $50 on her not surviving January. Clara picked up her wrapped purchases. She looked at Frank Dolan. He was waiting for fear, or desperation, or the specific kind of quiet that comes from someone who has been broken and is trying not to show it. He had seen all three before, and he knew how to read them. What he saw in Clara Holt's face was none of those things. She said, "Keep your money, Mr. Dolan. You are going to need it." She walked out. Behind her there was a moment of silence, and then laughter. The uncertain kind, the kind that happens when someone has said something, and no one is entirely sure what it means. Frank watched her go. His expression did not change visibly, but something shifted behind his eyes. A small, involuntary recalibration. The look of someone who has aimed at a target and struck something unexpected. The ride back was long and cold. Clara's face burned the whole way, not from the wind. The bet. $50 her life as a wager, her survival as a number, on which men placed their confidence or their doubt, as though her existence were a game in which they had a stake, and she were merely the board on which it was played. She passed the turnoff to the town's train station and kept riding. She did not look at the sign. That night she made a new entry. December 15th. Outside -2 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood consumption 7 pounds. Public bet placed on my death. $50 says I do not survive to January. Expected outcome survival. The numbers do not change because someone has placed a wager against them. She underlined the word numbers. Christmas came and went. Clara spent it alone. She allowed herself a small generosity. Biscuits made properly with the good flour she had been saving, and beans cooked with the last of the salt pork and coffee, with real sugar. She sat at her crate table and ate slowly, and let herself have the warmth without calculating it. Outside, the temperature was -8 degrees. Inside, it was 57. She thought about Callum in Chicago, probably working through the holiday because that was what factory work demanded, and what Callum had chosen over a Wyoming farm. She thought about Edmund, who had died in February of 1884, on a day much like this one, cold and clear and without mercy, and who had left her 17 engineering techs and a property with a mortgage and a cabin with 6 windows and an R value of 8. She thought about what he had known and what she had learned since, and whether those were the same thing or different things or something more complicated than either. She finished her meal, cleaned her plate, opened one of the engineering texts and read by lamplight until the fire had burned down to the kind of steady warmth that could carry her through the night without additional fuel. The year turned without ceremony. 1888 arrived. January began with a shift, not just colder, different. The cold of December had been dense and settled a weight pressing down from above. The cold that arrived in the first week of January was sharper, drier. A cold that had traveled a long distance and arrived with its original character intact. The cold of the Canadian plains moving south, without any of the moisture that normally accompanied it. January 1st. Outside -12 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside 56 degrees Fahrenheit. January 3rd. Outside -8 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside 55 degrees Fahrenheit. January 5th. Outside -25 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside 54 degrees Fahrenheit. The interior temperature was dropping, not dramatically, not in ways that crossed into danger, but measurably consistently in a direction. Clara increased her fuel consumption slightly, 8 pounds per day. Then 9. It held at 54 degrees. She reviewed her calculations. The wall was performing within its design parameters. There was simply a limit to what earth and air could do, a differential, beyond which additional mass could not fully compensate, and that limit was somewhere below -25 degrees outside temperature. She did not know exactly where the limit was. The books did not have data for this exact configuration. She was in territory that the engineering texts had not mapped, which meant she was working from principles rather than precedents, which was harder but not impossible, which was the story of this entire enterprise. January 7th. She woke to a different kind of silence. The wind had stopped. Clara sat up in her bedroll and listened. Nothing. No howl, no constant pressure against the earth walls, no creaking of the barn timbers under sustained lateral force. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that was itself a sound, the absence of something that had been present so long. Its absence was louder than its presence had been. She dressed and went outside. The air was shockingly cold, not the aggressive cold of wind, but a cold that was still and absolute. Each breath a small ordeal. Each inhalation introducing air into lungs that were not prepared for its temperature. The thermometer read -30 degrees. The sky was clear in a way that clear skies rarely are, every star close and distinct, the Milky Way a river of light overhead. The kind of sky that appears only when the atmosphere has been scoured of everything that interferes with seeing. She stood in it for 1 full minute. She looked north. The horizon in that direction was dark. But there was something in the air. A quality that was not visual exactly, more like pressure. The atmospheric feeling of something large, organizing itself at a distance. She had read descriptions of this in her father-in-law's journals, the notes he had kept as a young man, working railroad lines through the Rocky Mountain passes. Descriptions of a particular stillness that came before the worst storms. The atmosphere gathering itself the way a person gathers themselves before a significant effort. Clara went back inside. She checked her provisions with the systematic attention she brought to all critical assessments. Food adequate for 3 weeks. Water containers filled. Lamp oil. Matches. Stovepipe clear. She went to the woodpile and counted every log. Then she stacked it all inside. Every piece of exterior wood she had been keeping under canvas against the barn wall she moved inside now, hauling it in armload by armload until her arms stopped cooperating and she rested and then hauled more. She worked for 2 hours and then stood in the barn surveying what she had accomplished. The indoor woodpile was as large as she could make it. The barn door was sealed with the extra canvas she had prepared in November for exactly this contingency. She had thought about this moment since September. She had prepared for it with the same systematic attention she had brought to everything else. She sat at her table and wrote in her journal. January 8th. Atmospheric conditions suggest significant storm event approaching. Wind cessation at 3 a.m. temperature, -30 degrees Fahrenheit. All fuel relocated inside. Structure preparation complete. Estimated storm arrival 36 to 72 hours. The wall will be tested under conditions beyond any I have yet recorded. I have done what I can do. She closed the journal. January 10th. A slight warming. The temperature climbed to -10 degrees by noon, then to 0, then by late afternoon to an almost impossible +10 degrees above 0. Men came out of their cabins blinking in the thin winter sunlight, surprised by the relative warmth the way people are surprised by things that feel like mercy when they are actually something else. Children played in the snowdrifts. The mood in the valley, what she could observe of it from her barn, was something close to relief. Clara looked at the sky. The blue was fading at the edges, replaced by a color. She had no good word for a yellowish gray that sat at the horizon, like a bruise that had not yet decided to heal or worsen. The clouds were moving fast, too fast from the northwest, which was the direction that mattered. She barred the barn door from inside. She fed the stove 4 logs and watched the temperature climb to 60 degrees. She sat on her bedroll and waited. January 11th. Clear and warm, 18 degrees, almost no wind. The calm was absolute. Clara stood at the small gap in the barn wall she used for observing the weather and looked north. The sky in that direction had become the color of old bone. The clouds were low and churning, moving with a speed and intention that had nothing to do with the pleasant morning air around her. She could see the storm now, a wall of white stretching across the entire northern horizon. Still 50 miles away, but approaching with the unhurried certainty of something that did not need to hurry because the distance between itself and you was simply a matter of time. She had never seen anything like it. She had read descriptions in the railroad journals, in old newspaper accounts, in the recollections of men who had survived the worst winters of previous decades, and she had incorporated those descriptions into her preparation. But the sight of it was different from the reading of it. She went back inside. She opened her journal and wrote, January 11th, 1888. Storm visible on northern horizon. Estimated arrival tomorrow morning, possibly sooner. Exterior temperature 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Interior 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Supplies adequate. Structure sound. Everything that can be done has been done. She closed the journal. Outside, the first flakes began to fall, small and sparse, almost polite, the advance party of something that was not polite at all. By evening, the wind returned. Not the full force of it yet. Just the herald, the first pressure of the system's leading edge, enough to make the barn timbers speak. Clara banked the fire to a careful level and lay down. She did not sleep for a long time. She woke at 3 in the morning to a sound that was not wind as she had known wind. She had known wind for 15 years on this high plain. She had measured it, recorded it, built her entire thermal model around its properties and its patterns. She knew what 30 miles per hour felt like against the barn walls, what 40 felt like, what the gusts that came with the worst December storms felt like. This was different. This was not weather pressing against a structure. This was a physical force treating the structure as an obstacle it had not yet decided to acknowledge. The barn shuddered. Not the small adjustments of timber under wind load, but a full body shudder. A movement that traveled from the earth walls through the floor and into the bedroll and into her bones. The sound was a sustained, oscillating shriek produced by snow moving horizontally at a velocity that reclassified it from precipitation to projectile. Clara lit the lamp. She fed the stove 2 logs and checked the thermometer. Outside, through the small gap in the wall, she could see nothing. Not darkness. White. Static white horizontal and total visibility 0. Inside 50 degrees and falling. The wall was holding. She could feel it holding the difference between the temperature inside the air gap and the temperature outside the barn's original timber frame was palpable when she pressed her hand against the inner timber wall. Not warm, but not the brutal cold she would have felt on the other side of the earth wall, but the roof, the door seams, the small gaps in the original construction that she had always meant to address and had not fully addressed. These were letting in cold air in amounts she had not fully modeled. The temperature dropped to 48 degrees, then 46. She fed the stove more wood. The temperature stabilized at 46 degrees and held there through the rest of the night. The stove working at a level above her planned consumption rate. The margin she had lost to Frank Dolan's theft, now a real and present fact, rather than a number on a page. January 12th. The wind never stopped. The sound was a form of madness if you let it be. Clara did not let it be. She rationed the madness the way she rationed the wood, allowing herself to hear it for what it was. Weather physics, air moving at high velocity. Nothing personal. Nothing that knew her name, and then returning to the work of being warm and alive inside a structure she had built with her own hands and her own calculations. The temperature outside dropped to negative 28 degrees, inside 44 degrees. She was burning 12 pounds of wood per day now. The pile was shrinking in ways she could see without measuring. She measured anyway. The act of measuring was the act of remaining in control of what could be controlled. January 13th. The wind had been blowing for 36 hours without cessation. Outside -35 degrees. Inside 42 degrees. Clara fed the stove every hour. She wore everything she owned. 2 dresses, wool leggings. Edmund's old coat, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and tied at the waist with a length of rope. She moved as little as possible, conserving the heat her body generated. Treating herself as one more element in the thermal system she had designed and was now operating under conditions beyond its specified range. She did the calculation in her head. She had been doing it every hour. On the night of January 13th, sitting at her small table with the lamp casting its orange circle, and the wind screaming outside, and the temperature inside at 40 degrees and dropping, Clara Holt had her moment. Not panic. She had decided years ago that panic was a luxury she could not afford, and had removed it from her available options with the same deliberate economy she applied to everything. Not despair. Despair required giving up on the numbers, and she had not given up on the numbers. What she had was calculation. She stood up and walked to the woodpile. She counted. 62 logs, approximately 4 pounds each. 248 pounds of wood. At 12 pounds per day, she had 20 days of fuel. The storm was on its 2nd day. January had 18 days remaining. The math was close. Uncomfortably close. The margin that Frank Dolan had stolen in November was the margin she needed right now. Clara stood with the woodpile on her left. Then she turned and looked at the shelf on the east wall. Edmund's 17 engineering texts. Dry, dense, thick volumes with boards and heavy paper, and the accumulated weight of technical knowledge. She knew exactly how much heat they would produce because she had looked up the specific heat value of paper in one of those same texts years ago out of curiosity and had written the number in her journal. Because she wrote down all numbers that might someday be useful. She crossed to the shelf. She put her hand on the spine of the nearest volume. Principles of Heat Transfer, Volume 2. This was the book that had given her the convection equations, the air gap calculations, the mass-temperature relationship that was right now at this moment keeping 40 degrees of warmth inside this barn against a 35-degree below zero night. This book had given her the language for things she had observed, but not yet been able to prove. She stood with her hand on the spine, and she thought about 15 years. 15 years of mornings at 6 and evenings at 6. 15 years of numbers written in her own hand. The Badger Burrow in 1874, and the Storm Cellar. Data in 1876. And the 100 small observations that had accumulated into the understanding that the earth was warmer than the wind, and that this fact could be used by someone willing to pay attention to it long enough to know what to do with it. The books had not given her that understanding. They had given her the vocabulary to describe what she had already seen. The understanding was hers. It had always been hers. It lived in 9 leather journals on the shelf beside the engineering texts, and those journals were already inside her, were her. Were the 15 years of work that had produced this barn in this condition on this night. She could burn the books. She could not burn the journals. She could not burn what was inside her. She lifted her hand from the spine. She walked to the woodpile. She took 1 log. Not 2. 1. She carried it to the stove and opened the door and set it on the coals and watched the flame catch and climb. She closed the door. Inside temperature, 40 degrees. She was going to stay at 40 degrees through the worst storm in living memory on the fuel she had. Because the math said she could. And the math had not lied to her in 15 years. and she was not going to stop trusting it now. In the dark, in the cold, in the one moment when trusting it was the most difficult thing she had ever been asked to do. She wrapped herself in the blanket and sat down on the bedroll. She opened her journal. She wrote January 13th, 1888. Outside temperature, negative 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Fuel remaining 62 logs. The calculation holds. I trust the calculation. The wall is holding. The system is doing what it was designed to do under conditions that exceed its design specifications. This is what the numbers look like when the stakes are real. She closed the journal. She put her hands flat on the floor on either side of her and pressed down, feeling the solid, packed earth, the ground that did not freeze at depth, the ground that had been holding the warmth of the previous summer in its mass for months, giving it back. Now through the floor, through the straw, insulation through the granite. Hard sod wall with the patient indifference of something that did not need to be believed in to be true. The wind screamed. The stove crackled with one log. Clara Holt, 63 years old, alone sat in 40 degrees and waited. The storm ended on the morning of January the 15th. The way very large things end, not gradually, but all at once, as though something enormous had simply decided it was finished and moved on to somewhere else. Clara woke to stillness, not the false stillness of January 7th, not the loaded quiet of a system gathering itself. This was the stillness of aftermath of a world that had been through something and was now sitting in its own silence, trying to understand what remained. She lay on the bedroll for a moment and listened to the absence of sound and understood what it meant. Then she got up. The interior thermometer read 41 degrees. She had burned 36 pounds of wood in 72 hours running the stove at the minimum level that kept the temperature from crossing below 40. Adding one log at a time, holding the line with the same focused economy she had applied to every difficult thing in her life. 41 degrees. The storm had thrown its worst at the wall, and the wall had answered with 41 degrees. She put on Edmund's coat and the blanket tied at her waist, and she pushed the barn door open. The door was heavy. Snow had drifted against it during the night, and she had to put her shoulder into it, all her weight pushing until the drift gave, and the door swung out and the light hit her. The light was extraordinary. Wyoming, after a blizzard, produced a quality of light that had no equivalent in any other season or condition. A brilliance so total that it was physically disorienting every surface of every snowdrift, acting as its own source of illumination. The shadows blue and precise, and the lit surfaces so white they had no color at all. The sky above it was a blue so deep and clean it looked like something that had been polished. Clara stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it. The barn was half buried. Drifts had reached the eaves on the north and west sides, packed hard by the wind following the contours of the earth wall beneath them. The sod wall was invisible under 10 feet of snow in places, but the barn was standing. The roof was intact. The structure had absorbed 72 hours of sustained wind above 50 miles per hour, at temperatures approaching negative 40 degrees, and it was standing in the morning light, as though it had simply waited out the interruption and was now prepared to continue. Clara walked around the perimeter on legs that were stiff from cold and 3 days of limited movement. She examined the walls. She dug through snow with her hands in places to check the sod surface. The compressed earth was frozen to the hardness of stone, impervious, unchanged. She checked the air gap where she could access it from the south side. Dry. Still. The 2 feet of dead air had held its character through everything the storm had done to the outside of the wall. She went back inside and checked the thermometer one more time. Outside, -35 degrees. The air was still and the sun was rising and the temperature would climb throughout the day. But this was what the storm had left behind. This was what the land looked like now that the performance was over and the stage had been reset. Inside, 41 degrees, with no fire burning. The thermal mass was returning the heat it had been given steadily and without drama, the way it had been doing since November. Clara sat at her table and opened her journal. January 15th, 1888. Storm concluded. Duration 72 hours. Minimum exterior temperature, -38 degrees Fahrenheit. Minimum interior temperature, 40 degrees. Total fuel consumed during storm, 36 pounds. Structure performed beyond expectations under conditions exceeding design parameters. The wall held. The system held. She looked at what she had written. Then she added one more line. I held. She closed the journal. She fed the stove 4 logs and let the temperature climb while she ate the first real meal she had allowed herself in 3 days, oatmeal with dried fruit and coffee with sugar. Sitting at her table in a barn that was warming toward 55 degrees as the morning progressed, listening to the absolute silence of a world that had exhausted itself and was resting. 3 miles away, Silas Greer was prying up the last section of his kitchen floor. He had started on the furniture in the second day of the storm. The table first. Then the chairs one at a time, feeding the legs and rungs and seats into the stove in pieces small enough to fit. Watching the warmth they produced last an hour and a half at most, before the temperature in the cabin dropped again. Then the children's bed frame, the older ones understanding and saying nothing, moved to the floor with their blankets. Then the shelving from the east wall. Then the floorboards starting in the corners where they were easiest to pry up, working toward the center. Miriam held Grace through all of it. Grace had stopped coughing sometime in the night of January 13th, and that was when Miriam had understood. Not the stopping of a cough that meant improvement. The stopping that meant something else. Something the body does when it has finished its argument with the cold and the wet and the fever and has decided it will not argue anymore. Miriam had held her daughter through the night of the 13th and through the 14th and through the night of the 14th into the 15th, not because she did not understand what had happened, but because understanding and accepting are 2 different operations that do not happen at the same time. Silas knew. He had known since the 13th. He had kept prying up floorboards and feeding them into the stove because there was nothing else his hands knew how to do, and he needed his hands to be doing something. The ground outside was frozen solid. The depth of cold in the earth extended below the frost line by feet now. By the reckoning of a man who had been farming this land for 6 years and knew what it felt like and what it could do. There would be no burying until spring. The ground would not receive Grace until April, perhaps May, when the frost finally retreated to the depth where the temperature held constant, regardless of what the surface was doing. Miriam knew this too. She had arranged Grace in the corner of the cabin with the same careful attention she had given to every task in her life. The blankets smooth, the small hands folded, and she had sat down on the floor beside the corner, and she had not cried because crying required something she did not have remaining. On the morning of January 15th, when the storm stopped, Clara walked the 3 miles to the Greer cabin. She went because she needed to know. She had been thinking about Grace Greer for 3 days through the storm and the cold and the careful management of 40 degrees, thinking about the camphor oil and the written instructions she had sent back with Miriam. and whether they had been enough. Knowing with the part of her that did the calculations that they had probably not been enough, that the cabin's temperature and the inadequacy of the stove and the green wood burning poorly had been more than a small child with compromised lungs could negotiate. She walked through drifts that reached her waist in places, picking her way with the patient attention of someone who has learned that the only way through difficult terrain is one step at a time, that rushing costs more than it saves. Miriam opened the door. She did not speak. She looked at Clara for a moment, and then she looked toward the corner of the room. Clara entered. The cabin was 32 degrees. The floor had been stripped nearly to the subsoil in places. The stove was burning a chair leg. 3 children sat against the east wall under all the blankets remaining in the house. The 2 older ones with the particular stillness of children who have witnessed something and do not yet know how to put it in the order of things they understand. In the corner under a blanket, small and still. Clara stood for a moment. Then she crossed the room and sat down on the floor beside Miriam. She did not speak. There was nothing that words could do in this space at this moment that was worth doing. She sat beside Miriam Greer on the stripped floor of the stripped cabin, and she stayed there for a long time, long enough for the quality of the silence between them to change from the silence of strangers to something else. The silence of 2 women sitting with an unbearable fact and bearing it together, because there was no other way to bear it. After a while, Clara said, "When the ground thaws, I will help you." That was all she said. Miriam looked at her. Her eyes were dry and very dark, and carried in them the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent everything they had and is standing on the other side of it. She nodded once. Clara walked back to her barn. She sat at her table and opened her journal, and she did not write anything for a long time. She sat with the pen in her hand and the page blank, and she thought about the gap between the numbers and the world, the way the numbers showed clearly what needed to be done, and the world did not always do it in time, and about the difference between being right and being useful, and about whether those 2 things were the same thing or whether you could be one without the other. Then she wrote January 15th continued. Grace Greer, age 3. Gone. The cabin temperature was inadequate. The wood supply was inadequate. The stove was inadequate. None of this was a surprise to the numbers. The numbers had shown it clearly for 6 weeks. The numbers needed a builder. She set down the pen. She looked at the 9 journals on the shelf. 15 years of mornings and evenings. 15 years of 2 readings per day. The Badger Burrow in 1874, and the Storm Cellar in 1876. And every observation between them and after them, everything the land had told her about the relationship between earth and air and cold and warmth. If you paid attention to it long enough to understand what it was saying. The numbers were not enough on their own. They never had been. A number was only as useful as the action it produced. She understood this now with a clarity she had not had in September, when the clarity she had possessed was about the thermal model and the fuel calculations and the construction timeline. This was a different kind of clarity. This was the clarity that comes from sitting on a stripped floor beside a woman who has just lost her child in a cold that could have been managed, and understanding what managed means and what it costs when it is not done. 3 miles in the other direction, Earl Stratton was on his horse. He had gone out in the early afternoon of January 15th to survey the damage. This was what you did after a storm of this magnitude. You rode the perimeter of what you owned, and you counted what you had lost, and you began the calculation of what it would cost to continue. He had lost 3 head of cattle, found them frozen together in a draw on the northwest corner of his range, standing upright the way cattle sometimes froze the cold. having caught them before they went down. He had found 2 outbuildings with collapsed roofs, the weight of the snow having exceeded what the structures were designed to hold. He had found 40 feet of fence line buried under drifts that would take a week to clear. His wood supply was critically diminished. He had 10 cords remaining. February was always the coldest month. The calculation did not work. He found the Kinsley homestead silent and went to check on them, and found them alive, but barely huddled in a kitchen that was 38 degrees the family patriarch, with the look of a man who had just learned something about his own limitations that he would not forget. Earl stayed long enough to bring in their remaining wood and stack it near the stove and say what needed to be said, which was not much. He rode past 2 more homesteads in various states of damage and survival. Then, because he was already on the South Road, and because he could not have said precisely why he rode toward the Holt property, he came over the rise that gave a view of the barn and the surrounding quarter section, and he pulled his horse up. The barn was standing. He had known intellectually that this was the likely outcome, or at least a possible outcome, since the morning of January 18th of the previous week, when he had ridden past and seen the thin wisp of smoke and Clara Holt moving with the easy, unhurried efficiency of someone who was warm and had margin. But intellectual knowledge and the sight of a thing are not the same, and the sight of the barn standing after what had just happened, half buried under enormous drifts, but structurally intact, its roof clear and its walls solid, was a different kind of information than anything he had calculated. Then the barn door opened. Clara came out. She was carrying a small bucket. She was wearing her wool dress and Edmund's old coat, the coat she always wore, and the coat was not fully fastened, not buttoned to the throat against the wind. Open at the collar, the front hanging loose the way you wore a coat when you were stepping outside for a moment on a mild autumn morning to check on something and the temperature was not a serious consideration. The temperature was -20 degrees. Earl sat on his horse on the ridge and watched Clara Holt walk across the snow in her loosely worn coat, unhurried, purposeful to a drift along the north wall, where she scooped snow into the bucket with a gloved hand, and then turned and walked back to the barn with the same unhurried ease. He sat on his horse for a long time after the barn door had closed behind her. 40 years on this frontier. 40 winters, some of them bad, and some of them very bad, and some of them the kind that took people. He had built structures from the Dakotas to Colorado, had understood wood and stone, and the mathematics of heat loss. Since before this woman had ever come to Wyoming, he knew what 40 below zero looked like from inside a well-built structure. And he knew what it cost to maintain warmth. And he knew the number of logs per hour, and the cord per week, and all the calculations he had learned the way you learn things that your life depends on. He had never seen anyone do what he had just seen. He turned his horse and rode home, but the image stayed with him through the night, through the dinner he barely tasted, and the fire he fed mechanically, and the bed he lay in without sleeping. The unbuttoned coat, the unhurried walk, the bucket of snow taken without urgency or effort from the drift against the north wall, while the thermometer outside read 20 below zero, the thin wisp of smoke from the stovepipe, the same thin wisp he had seen in October and November and December. Never the thick, desperate smoke of a fire being frantically overfed. Always the controlled, adequate smoke of a system that was working as designed. He was burning 10 cords of wood and his house was 46 degrees. She was burning what he could not yet calculate but knew was far less, and she was going outside to collect snow for water in an unbuttoned coat. On the morning of January 20th, Earl Stratton loaded a quarter cord of his best split ash onto a sledge and drove it to the Holt property. He had told Helen he was making a charitable call, checking on the widow doing what neighbors did after a hard storm. Helen had looked at him the way she sometimes looked at him when she understood something about his motivations that he had not yet acknowledged to himself. And she had said that was a good thing to do and gone back to her mending. He pulled up 20 feet from the barn door and sat on the sledge for a moment. The sun was out. The temperature was -8 degrees warmer than it had been. He climbed down and walked to the barn door and knocked. The door opened almost immediately. Clara Holt looked at him with the calm, steady attention he had come to recognize as her default expression, the look of someone who was assessing a situation with the same systematic interest she applied to everything. She was wearing a simple wool dress, a shawl over her shoulders. Her hair was neat. Her face was healthy. Rested neither the paleness of someone who had been too cold, nor the flush of someone who had been working too hard to stay warm. She looked like someone who had spent the past week in a room at a comfortable temperature reading books. "Mr. Stratton," she said. "Miss Holt." He gestured toward the sledge. "Brought some wood. Thought you might be running low." Clara looked at the sledge. Quarter cord of prime ash, well seasoned the best he had. She looked at it the way she had looked at him, with assessment, taking in the information and placing it in relation to other information she already possessed. "That is kind," she said, "but I have enough." Earl looked past her into the small partitioned space visible through the open door. He could see the woodpile in the corner. Perhaps 60 logs, maybe a few more. He did the calculation in his head, the way he would have calculated any structure's fuel requirement. At normal consumption rates, that was 3 or 4 days of wood, 5 at the outside. "That will not last long," he said. "It will last until March," she said. Earl stared at her. He pulled his professional surveyor's thermometer from his coat pocket. The calibrated instrument he carried for assessment work, accurate to within 1 degree, the most reliable tool of its kind available in the territory. "May I take a reading?" he said. "Go ahead." He entered the barn and hung the thermometer from the nearest nail on the timber post and waited 3 minutes, standard protocol, the discipline he applied to every measurement. Because a measurement taken in haste was worse than no measurement at all. While he waited, he looked at the space, 10 feet by 10 feet, simple, clean, organized with the spare precision of someone who had thought carefully about what they needed and had neither more nor less than that. He touched the inner surface of the barn's original timber wall. Cool, not cold, not even approaching cold, and dry, bone dry, with no sign of the moisture he had predicted with such confidence on the morning of September 29th, when he had told her the wet earth would get into the posts and produce rot, and the whole structure could come down on her head by next winter. He looked at the thermometer. 57 degrees Fahrenheit. He picked it up and examined it in the lamplight. Checked the calibration mark, held it at arm's length, the way he did when he was not willing to trust what he was seeing until he had looked at it a second time. The reading was clear. He walked to the door and checked the exterior thermometer mounted to the barn wall. -8 degrees. He went back inside and looked at the interior thermometer again. 57 degrees. The differential was 65 degrees. He was burning 2,000 pounds of wood per month, and his house was sitting at 46 degrees. She was burning something he had not yet calculated, but knew was a fraction of that, and her interior temperature was 11 degrees warmer than his. Earl Stratton sat down on the wooden crate that served as her table without being invited, because his legs had decided that standing was not what was required at this moment. "How much wood are you burning?" he said. "About 5 pounds per day now," she said. It was higher during the storm. 8 or 9. but the system has stabilized. He did the arithmetic in his head. 5 pounds per day, 35 per week, 140 per month. His own monthly consumption was roughly 15 times that. She was maintaining a temperature 11 degrees warmer than his house on 1/15 of the fuel. He walked to the 2-foot air gap between the sod wall and the original barn timbers and looked at it. Really looked at it this time, not with the dismissal of October, but with the attention of someone who has been wrong and knows it, and is trying to understand exactly how and why. The dead air, the convection barrier, the thermal mass of 3 feet of compressed earth beyond it. He pressed his hand against the inner timber surface again. Dry, not cold. He walked outside. He circled the barn. He dug into the snow on the north face to expose a section of the sod wall. The earth was frozen solid, dense, and impervious 3 feet of compressed thermal mass that had been doing its work for 3 months, while he had been burning through his winter's wood supply at a rate that was going to leave him short before spring. He came back inside. "May I examine the interior?" he said. "You are already inside," she said. He almost smiled. Not quite. He spent an hour looking at everything she had built with the professional attention of a man who had been constructing things for 4 decades and had just encountered something that was better than anything he had ever seen. He asked about the foundation trench and the gravel drainage. He asked about the course spacing and the perpendicular ties. He asked about the air gap dimension and whether she had considered varying it. He asked about the stove placement and the pipe angle and the choice of partition materials. Clara answered every question. She answered them the way she answered everything, with precision and without elaboration, giving him exactly what he asked for and trusting him to know what to do with it. Finally, he sat back on the crate. "I called you the tomb builder," he said, "not to your face. But I said it." She looked at him without expression. "I told everyone you were building something that would collapse or rot or kill you. I said it in front of men who were listening and who repeated it. I bet $50 in the trading post that you would not survive to January." He paused. The words were not easy. They were the words of a man who had been wrong about something that had cost people things he could not give back. "I lost the bet." He said it plainly. "And I lost more than the bet. I lost every argument I made in October. Everything I told you about moisture and structural risk and the weight of the earth on unbraced walls." He gestured at the space around them, the dry timber, the sound posts, the warm air. Every one of those things was wrong. Clara looked at him for a long moment. The lamp between them cast its steady light. Outside, the world was cold and still and brilliant. She said, "I know you are sorry. You do not need to say the rest of it." "I want to understand it," he said. "The principle, the mathematics. Because my family was cold all winter. Because my ranch hands could barely function. Because the Greer child." He stopped. He looked at his hands. "Because people are dying and you are sitting here reading books in 57-degree warmth, and I need to understand what I missed and what I should have known." He looked up. "Will you teach me?" The question was simple and direct, and it cost him something to ask it. She could see that it cost him. She had watched him arrive with quarter cord of ash on a sledge as a gesture of charity toward a woman he had expected to find frozen in her barn. And she had watched him encounter instead a temperature differential that had reorganized everything he understood about heat and shelter, and who was competent to build what on this high plane. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about September 29th and the dismissal in his voice and the pity under the dismissal. The particular pity of someone who believed they were watching a person make a final, irreversible mistake. She thought about the trading post and the $50 bet and the sound of laughter that was not entirely mean but was not interested in being kind. She thought about Miriam Greer sitting on a stripped floor with her arms empty. Then she said, yes, but spring is better for building. The ground needs to thaw. She went to the shelf and took down her journals, all 9 of them, and set them on the crate between them. Then she took down 3 of Edmund's engineering texts. She opened the oldest journal to the first dated entry, September 15th, 1872, and she set it in front of him. Then she sat down on her bedroll across from him, and she began to talk. She talked for 2 hours. She explained the principle of thermal mass and why Earth stored heat when wood consumed it. She explained convection and why still air resisted heat transfer in ways that moving air could not. She explained the relationship between surface area and volume and why the size of a space was not just a practical question, but a thermal one. She showed him the 15 years of data, the Badger Burrow observation from 1874, the storm cellar measurements, the progressive refinement of her model as the data accumulated, and she understood more clearly what the data was showing. Earl Stratton listened like a student. He asked questions that showed he was following the principles and not just the surface of the explanation. He took out a small notebook and wrote things down. He went back over sections she had covered and asked her to repeat the parts he had not yet fully understood. He was not a man who learned quickly, but he was a man who learned completely, who did not move to the next thing until the previous thing was solid, and that made him exactly the kind of student that the subject required. When he finally left, the sun was low in the sky, painting the snow in the long gold light of a Wyoming winter afternoon. He climbed onto the sledge with the quarter cord of ash still on it, and he sat for a moment looking back at the barn. He had come here with charity, and he was leaving with something he did not have a word for yet, something between humility and intention. The particular quality of a man who has seen his error completely and has decided what to do about it. He rode home through the gathering cold, his mind already working on the problem of the Greer cabin. The official visit came on February 1st. Mr. Aldrich arrived in his county buggy accompanied by a surveyor named Thompson, a quiet man who said very little but whose eyes missed nothing. Aldrich had filed his report in October, the one noting the unconventional and potentially hazardous nature of the structure. He was back now because the structure had survived the worst storm in living memory, and the numbers it had produced during and after that storm had reached the county office through channels he had not anticipated, which was to say that Earl Stratton had ridden to town in late January and told anyone who would listen what he had found on the Holt property and what the thermometer had read and what the fuel consumption had been. And the story had reached Aldrich's desk in the form of a question he could not ignore. "Miss Holt," he said when she opened the barn door, "I am here to conduct an official assessment with your permission." "Of course," she said. They spent 3 days. Aldrich and Thompson measured everything: wall thickness, air gap dimensions, thermal performance at different times of day, in different weather conditions. They brought calibrated instruments, and they used them with the systematic care of men performing work that might be cited. They recorded exterior temperatures averaging -6 degrees and interior temperatures averaging 56 degrees with fuel consumption, documented at approximately 6 pounds per day. Thompson was a man of few words, but on the afternoon of the 3rd day, as he was packing his instruments into their cases, he said, "Without preamble, I have surveyed 400 structures in this territory. This is the most efficient one I have ever measured, by a factor of 10. Aldrich wrote his report with the careful precision of a man who understood that what he was documenting had implications beyond the immediate property assessment. He included Clara's calculations. He cited her methodology. He noted her age and her circumstances in the absence of any formal engineering training. And he noted these things not to diminish the achievement, but because they were relevant to any accurate account of how the achievement had been accomplished. The report was titled Thermal Performance Assessment, Earth Mass Construction, Laramie County, Wyoming Territory. He filed it on February 15th. Copies were distributed to the Territorial Agricultural Office. By March, the report had reached Montana and Dakota Territory and Nebraska. By April, engineers in 3 territories were requesting additional documentation. The winter began to break in late February, the temperature climbing above freezing during the afternoon hours, the snow beginning its slow retreat from the south-facing slopes first. The valley counted its losses. 7 people dead in total. Emma Greer was the youngest. An old man named Horvath, who had lived alone, was found when his neighbors dug out the road and came to check on him. 5 others scattered across the territory, all in cabins, all in structures that had lost the argument with what January had asked of them. Earl Stratton came to Clara on the first day of March. He came with a plan already formed, which was his way of coming to things, having done the preliminary work before asking for what he needed. "The Greers want to build," he said. "I'm going to help them, but I need you to advise." They rode to the Greer property together. Silas was there, thinner than Clara had seen him in October, with the hollow-eyed look of a man who has been through something that has removed everything that was not essential. Miriam sat on the porch step in the weak February sun, not doing anything, just sitting, which was itself a kind of statement about where she was in the work of recovering from winter. Earl explained the principle. Clara showed them her diagrams, the cross-section of the barn that she had drawn on August 12th of the previous year. And that had been the foundation of everything that followed. They proposed a simplified version for the Greer cabin, just the north wall 2 feet thick instead of 3. Which would provide an R value of approximately 25 instead of 40, but would make a measurable difference in a space as small as the Greer cabin. Silas listened. When they finished, he said, "Will it work?" Clara said, "Yes." "Will it keep my family warm?" She looked at him. "Yes." Silas looked at his wife. Something passed between them. Not words, the particular communication of 2 people who have been through something together that nothing else could have prepared them for. Then he looked back at Clara. "We will do it," he said. They started in mid-March when the ground had softened enough to cut. Earl brought 2 of his ranch hands to help. Clara came 3 days per week to check the work, answer questions, solve the problems that arose in the field, when what you were building met the actual conditions of the earth, rather than the theoretical conditions of a diagram. The work went faster with 4 people, and the right tools and the knowledge of what they were doing, as opposed to 1 woman alone in September, with a homemade leverage system. The north wall was complete in 3 weeks. By the time they finished, 6 other families had come to watch. And the watching was a different kind of watching than the watching from the county road in October. Not the speculative observation of people deciding whether to laugh, but the serious attention of people who needed what they were seeing. Earl stood on the Greer porch on the day the wall was completed, and he spoke to the small crowd that had accumulated the way a man speaks when he has thought carefully about what he wants to say and is going to say it regardless of how it sits with his own history. He said, "I was wrong about this." He said it plainly, without qualification or elaboration, the way you say things when you want the sentence to stand on its own weight. He gestured toward Clara, where she stood at the edge of the crowd. "I told her she was building a tomb." I bet money she would be dead by January. I was wrong about all of it, and people in this valley suffered for what I got wrong." He paused. "She is the most careful builder I have ever known, and I have been building on this plain for 40 years. If you want to survive next winter with less wood and more warmth, and your family intact, you will listen to what she has to say." The adoption moved through the valley, the way good ideas move when they are demonstrated, rather than argued by example and by evidence by the visible fact of what the Holt barn had done in January and what the Greer north wall was going to do next winter. By summer, 7 families had started projects. Some built full enclosures. Others did partial walls, just the north and west faces the directions that mattered most. The complexity varied, but the principle was consistent. Earth and air and thermal mass applied in whatever form the site and the resources and the available labor permitted. Clara consulted on every one. She was compensated sometimes in goods and sometimes in labor and occasionally in cash, and mostly in the knowledge that the next winter would be different from the last one, that the work she had done and the knowledge she had built over 15 years was moving outward through the valley in the form of walls and air gaps and the simple fact of families who were warm. Earl retrofitted the north and west walls of the Stratton Ranch House in June, adding 2 feet of compacted earth sloped against the foundation. The work taking 2 weeks and costing almost nothing except labor. When he checked the interior temperature the following November against outside conditions matching what he had recorded the previous November, the differential had increased by 30 degrees. Helen Stratton stood in the front room of her house and looked at the thermometer reading, and wept with the quiet relief of a woman who had been cold for many winters and was now being told that cold was a problem that had been solved. The winter of 1888 to 1889 was milder than the previous year, but it was still Wyoming and still December and still January. And the numbers that mattered were not the numbers of that winter's temperature, but the numbers of its outcomes. 0 cold-related deaths in the valley. 0. Families that had burned 2 cords per month through the previous winter were burning half a cord. The money not spent on firewood went to livestock and equipment, and seed the reinvestment of survival into the possibility of something beyond survival. People remembered where it had come from. In October of 1888, Aldrich filed a supplementary report to the Territorial Agricultural Office, this one titled Recommended Methods for Winter Shelter Fortification, and the subtitle read, The Holt Method of Earth Mass Construction. The report was distributed to every county in the territory, and from there to Montana and Dakota and Nebraska and Colorado. By 1892, 100 structures across the Great Plains used some variation of the technique. The bulletin cited Clara by name. It noted that she had designed and implemented the system at age 63 alone without formal engineering training. She became briefly known, the way people became known in that period, and that place through the circulation of documents and the memory of the people who had seen the thing itself. A journalist from Cheyenne came to interview her in the spring of 1889. He wanted the story of triumph of defiance of a widow standing alone against a winter that had killed 200 people across the Great Plains. He wanted the version that had a shape and a meaning that fit within the space of a newspaper column. Clara answered his questions politely and precisely. She gave him the data. She gave him the thermal calculations. She gave him the specific R values and the air gap dimensions and the fuel consumption figures. When he asked how she had survived, she said, "I paid attention. I did the math. The earth is warmer than the wind. This is not new. It is just correct." The article ran anyway, and it was good, and it spread as good articles do. On December 23rd of 1888, a letter arrived from Chicago. The handwriting on the envelope was Callum's. Clara sat at her table and held the envelope for a moment, Then she opened it. The letter was short. He had heard about the reports about the Aldrich Bulletin, about the journalist's article. He had heard about it from a colleague who had come across the territorial report in a government office and had mentioned it. And Callum had read the citation and his mother's name and had sat very still for a long time. The letter said I was wrong. I am sorry. May I visit? He came on December 26th, riding the train from Chicago to Cheyenne, and then a stage to the valley through roads that were passable this December. In a way, they had not always been passable. A fact that was related in ways Callum did not yet understand to the work his mother had done, and the knowledge that had moved through the valley over the previous 12 months. He walked into the barn. The warmth hit him the way warmth hits a person who has been outside in the cold, immediately and completely, the air wrapping around him like something physical. He stopped. He looked at the interior thermometer, 58 degrees. He looked at the stove, which was burning at a level he could see was minimal 2 or 3 logs at most. He looked at the woodpile, still substantial despite the weeks of winter already past. Then he looked at his mother. Clara was sitting at her table with a book open in front of her and a cup of coffee. She looked rested. She looked warm. She looked exactly like someone who had spent the past 15 months exactly where she had chosen to be, doing exactly what she had chosen to do, and who had been right about all of it. He said I was wrong. He said it simply the way his mother answered questions without excess and without apology, just the fact of the thing. I doubted you. I should not have. Clara stood up and crossed to him and held him for a moment. Her son, who was 42 years old and had left her $12 and a note telling her she would be dead before Christmas. She held him the way you hold someone when you are glad they came, and you are also entirely at peace with what happened in between. You gave me $12, she said. That helped. He looked at her. How did it help? He was genuinely asking. She told him about the $12 under the floorboard, about how she had read his note and folded it and put it back and gone to get the shovel, about how the existence of the money had been in some way she had never fully analyzed, a kind of anchor, the knowledge that she could always leave if the numbers stopped working, which meant she never needed to wonder about leaving because the numbers had never stopped working. Callum stayed through January. He helped Earl Stratton with the south wall reinforcement. The older man had been planning since summer. He learned the technique from Clara and from Earl together, the two of them teaching him from different directions, the theoretical from his mother and the practical from the man who had been building on this plane for 40 years and who had decided that learning the right thing late was better than continuing to do the wrong thing with conviction. When Callum left in February to return to Chicago, he took plans with him drawn in Clara's precise hand, annotated with her notes, the full system documented, as completely as the 9 journals and the 17 engineering texts had allowed her to document it. Spring came to the valley with the particular generosity it shows after a hard winter, the temperature climbing in steps, the snow retreating from the south-facing slopes. First, as it always did, the creek running clear and high with the melt. The cottonwoods along the creek bottom put out their first leaves in April, tentative and pale, and by May they were full and green and throwing the particular shifting shadows that meant summer was coming, and the long argument with cold was temporarily suspended. On the evening of May 15th, Clara sat alone in the barn for the last time that spring. She would be moving back to the cabin for summer, which she did every year. The barn returning to its function as a barn, and her life redistributing itself between the two structures, the way it always had and would, until she built the house she had been thinking about since February, the one she had begun designing in the back pages of the 9th journal, the permanent structure that would incorporate everything she had learned about earth and air and thermal mass into something built from the beginning to be a home, rather than adapted from an existing barn. She sat at the crate table in the last light of an afternoon that was warm enough to leave the door open. The air came in from outside, mild and smelling of new grass and creek water, and the particular freshness of Wyoming in May, the freshness of country that has been through a hard winter and has come out the other side. She opened the oldest of her 9 journals. September 15th, 1872. Arrived. Temperature at arrival 68 degrees Fahrenheit, wind from northwest. Edmund says this land will break you if you let it. I intend not to let it. She turned to the last page she had written on January 15th of the previous year, the day the storm ended, and she had walked to Miriam Greer and sat on a stripped floor and said the only thing that could be said. Then she turned to the first blank page. She picked up her pen. She wrote the date. May 15th, 1889. Then she wrote, "What I have learned." She sat for a moment, the pen in her hand, the open journal in front of her, the barn around her with its earth walls and its air gap, and the 15 years of observation and calculation embedded in every decision she had made about its construction. Then she wrote what she had been working towards since the morning in 1874, when she had crouched at a badger burrow in the east pasture with a thermometer. The earth does not fight the cold. It does not burn against it or argue with it or try to outlast it with force. It simply holds what it has been given and gives it back when it is needed. This is not cleverness. It is not invention. It is what the earth does because it is the earth. Because mass holds warmth and depth, holds stability. And the things that endure are the things that understand the difference between what can be controlled and what simply needs to be accepted and used. I have been sitting in 57 degrees in a Wyoming January. I have watched a community learn what I know. I have watched the numbers move from the page into the walls of houses and into the warmth of families who are alive because of what the numbers said. This is what 15 years of paying attention looks like. She closed the journal. She set it on the shelf beside the other 8, beside Edmund's 17 volumes, beside the lamp and the matches and the small iron pot. She looked at them all for a moment, the accumulated weight of what she had learned and what she had built and what she had given to the valley around her. Then she stood up, her knees making their usual comment, and she walked to the barn door and stood in the opening. The valley spread out below her in the May evening light, gold and green and enormous, the grass moving in the steady northwest wind, the way it always moved in long, slow waves traveling east, like something that was on its way to somewhere else. The creek caught the light. The cottonwoods along its banks were full and rustling. 3 miles away, she could see the roofline of the Greer cabin above its new north wall, and beyond it, the distant shape of the Stratton ranch house against the hills. Clara stood in the barn door in the evening light of a Wyoming spring, and she was not afraid of next winter. She knew where the warmth was. She had put it there.